This review session is going to focus on industrialization and revolutions, with a going to spread over a couple of units, 4, 5, and 6. And our essential question today, what we're looking for, is how revolutionary was the period 1750 to 1900 in transforming political and economic life. And I want you to think about what I want to do is present and set up the scene where revolutions and industrialization is happening. I want you to imagine a world where kings rule by divine right, where most people live and die in rural villages, and where social class is fixed at birth. You're born into it. This is the global norm before 1750. But beneath the surface, change is building. Enlightenment thinkers, mostly in Europe, begin questioning authority, arguing that governments should protect natural rights like life, liberty, and property, that governments have obligations to the people, as instead of just protecting them and just making sure they're economically profitable, that people have their own personal rights that need to be honored, their life, their liberty, and the property they own, including their homes and their farms and businesses. These ideas don't stay in the books of the educated, enlightened thinkers. These ideas spread, and they spread down into social classes, to the farmers, to the workers, people who are not considered elite, as well as they spread from community to community, village to village, nation to nation, and eventually region to region around the world. And these enlightened ideas challenge the very foundations of monarchies, where monarchies originally looked for legitimacy through connection to the divine or to religion. Either they represented God or God's will, as the king emperors in China did with the heavens mandate, or in Europe, where kings said they were the physical embodiment and the representative of God's kingdom, which was their idea of the divine right of monarchy, or in the Islamic nations, where those leaders also said that they were legitimate because they were connected to religious legitimacy, being faithful followers of Islam. These enlightened ideas that these monarchs also had a responsibility to protect people and their individual rights and their property was a new demand put on monarchies. And this demand comes from the Enlightenment. And at the same time, new economic pressures are emerging around the world, coming from trade networks, which are expanding across the globe through sea trade, the Atlantic sea routes, and populations are growing, much because of food distributions and economic opportunity. Remember that in the Columbian Exchange across the Atlantic, highly nutritious vegetable foods, such as corn, potato, masa, a root vegetable that became very popular in Africa, and corn, if I hadn't already mentioned, moves to the New World. And these calorie-dense vegetables grow in areas where wheat and barley struggled to grow. And they grow quite well, with potato being famous in Ireland, and the cassava root famous in Africa, corn just about everywhere. These new populations explode, and that also is the new people are labor forces and ideas that are going to expand economies. This expanding economic pressure creates tension between the old elites who ruled because of inherited social class and rising social groups such as the merchant class. Then in the beginning of the 1700s, revolutions erupt. The American Revolution challenges the colonial rule. The French Revolution overturns monarchy and turns social hierarchy upside down. No longer are they going to have aristocratic societies. They imagine a world in France where everyone is equal, egalitarianism. The Haitian Revolution becomes the only successful slave revolt in history, so expect to see that on your AP exam. And across Latin America, from Mexico to Brazil, Argentina, independence movements break away from European control. These are now areas they're going to govern themselves. But political revolutions are only half the story. At the same time, a different kind of revolution begins in Britain. This is the Industrial Revolution. Instead of changing governments, the Industrial Revolution transformed how people work, live, and produce goods. Factories replaced homes and people who crafted at home. Industrial machines replace manual labor, and cities, such as London, grow rapidly. So this period is revolutionary from 1750 to 1900 in two ways, both politically and economically. And the key question for us today is not just what changed, but how deeply these changes transformed the world. I'd like to move on to those ideas that sparked revolutions. And to understand revolutions, we have to start with ideas, specifically the Enlightenment. And here's where I'm going to have names for you. Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke from Britain and Jean-Jacques Rousseau from France argued that political authority did not come from God, but from the people. Governments, both of these men said, exist to protect the natural rights of people. And if these governments fail to protect the natural rights of people, people have the right to overthrow the government. This was a huge shift because before 1750, no one had a right to overthrow a legitimate leader. They were all put there by God in some way. And to overthrow that leader or challenge that leader would be to challenge God, something you just could not do, a wrong to be sure, or a sin for sure. To overthrow a king would be to challenge the representative of God himself, but not be done. To challenge the emperor of China would be to challenge the mandate of heaven. And indeed, it was done in China, but it was a very serious undertaking by those who did it. And definitely in the Islamic nations, any one of them, whether it had been Persia or the Ottoman Empire or the Abbasid Caliphate that existed in Spain, the Abbasid Caliphate in near Asia and Spain with Cordoba, any challenge to a Muslim leader was to challenge their standing in faith. It's very difficult to do. Not to say it was impossible, but it was difficult. But now, when these people were seen just as leaders because they were in a beneficial social position or born correctly, not placed there by God, but placed there by the luck of birth, and were just simply men, people had a right to challenge men because they were no longer representatives of God or faith. This was a big move and will lead to revolutions and political reform movements all over the world. So these ideas that people could challenge government and not offend God, these ideas spread through books, through salons where people sat and spoke over cups of coffee and cups of tea, and conversations that men had with each other and women had with each other, especially among the educated elites, those people who were most likely to influence change in government and to want change in government became very popular with them. These were educated people who did not benefit from the existing system and were willing to change it, and now they had the ability to do it. What makes this period different than earlier is that these ideas began to inspire action. In North America, the colonists used Enlightenment ideas to justify their independence from Britain, resulting in the United States of America. In France, revolutionaries changed not just the king by killing him, but the entire social order, getting rid of all aristocracy and all titles in the effort for equality. They also removed privilege based on birth. Being born was simply that. It was no longer a guarantee automatically to political or economic power. In Haiti, enslaved people who were enslaved by the French on a massive sugar plantation, which was Haiti, these enslaved people took these ideas even further, arguing that liberty and equality should apply to everyone, not just men, not just European or white men, but even former slaves. Here's the key point I'm trying to deliver to all of you. Enlightenment ideas didn't automatically create revolutions. The Enlightenment ideas provided the language and justification for change, but economic hardship, so in France and in Haiti, inequality, France and Haiti, political instability, United States, what pushed people to act. So when you analyze revolutions, think about both ideas and the conditions those people were in, because both matter. All right, we're going to continue reviewing, but remember that the skills these questions were asking, it's expecting you to identify arguments, connect ideas to actions, and contextualization, putting this stuff in context. I'd like to move on to what actually changed. So here's my mini lecture on revolution in action. Revolutions promise change, but how much do they actually deliver? In many cases, revolutions dramatically reshape political systems. Monarchies fall, constitutions are written, and ideas like citizenships and rights become more important. But at the same time, not everything changes. Social hierarchies often remain. Elites still remain elites. Women, for example, are largely excluded from political rights despite revolutionary talk about equality. Even in France, which promised equality for everyone, it wasn't granted to women. And Napoleon himself initially argued for the equality of women, but once he became in power, when he became the consul of Paris and later to be the emperor of France, he had to go back on his speeches for arguing for equality for women, because in order to stay in power, he needed to have the support of conservative social elements who in France who were willing to kill a king and willing to get rid of nobility, but weren't willing to see women be seen as equals. Economic inequality also persists in many regions around the world. Just because we believe that people may be politically equal or socially equal doesn't mean we're ready yet to make them economically equal. The poor still have a way of remaining poor, and the rich have a way of remaining rich. This creates a key historical pattern. Revolutions often produce both change and continuity. Revolutions transform political structures, but deeper social and economic systems can be slower to shift, and so they often remain the same. That's why AP questions often ask you to evaluate the extent of change, not just identify the change that occurred. So when you think about revolutions, don't just ask what changed, ask how much changed and what stayed the same. I think in the chat, if I did it right, and I'm learning, I have a poll. Which do you think changed more in this revolutionary period? The votes are anonymous.
Mr. Which period?
From 1750 to 1900. Sounded like a very fast answer. What else do we have here? I'm going to go back to the chat and see what the votes are. Huh. Forgive me for a second. I'm trying to find my poll. Oh. So I see that 3 people have voted for political systems, 4 voted for economic. Nobody chose social structures. Oh my goodness. Let's see if you can see the poll. I would like to ask my voters. Oh my gosh. I lose myself in the script, and that's not good. I'd like to ask my voters, who picked economic systems? Anybody? And can you explain your answer? Why economic systems? Maria and Ahmed. Let's see now. Let Maria go first. Her hand was up there. Maria, why was economic systems something that changed more?
I think like one of the main reasons is because the Industrial Revolution like transformed economies from aggregate
Agrarian. It's a big word. I
yeah,
know.
sorry, I
Agrarian.
forgot how to pronounce it.
No, it's okay.
And
It's not an everyday word.
yeah, and
Farming.
artisan-based productions into a more factory-based industrial capitalism, and the expansion of global trade networks like connected Europe, Asia, and Africa and America more tightly. And it was also the growth of wage labor and mass production, and which overall just like created new financial systems.
Okay, give me an example of a new financial system. Don't just say that.
I can't really think of one right now.
I can give you one right now.
Yeah.
Joint stock companies.
Okay.
Joint stock companies where people pooled together their money. It becomes a stock market. People pool their money to invest in trade, ships, overland caravans, so everyday people can profit in the shares that they own. This was different than before 1750, when these big explorations and big trades were done by kings, whether it was Mansa Musa in Africa or kings like in Portugal, that's in Spain, that sent ships abroad, or kings in England, where they benefited from the trade, and it was limited. It exploded with joint stock companies because now everyday people can buy into it, and it created the super rich merchant class. Bingo. There you go. Love it. Joint stock trade. Mr. Ahmed, you said economic systems. Why is economic systems, why do you think that changed more?
In my opinion, I think the economic changes in this period were a precursor to the social reforms and the political reforms.
Yeah, it definitely had a political impact. That's true at the economic, but you're saying that economic systems changed. What in the economic systems?
Industrialization,
There
urbanization,
you go.
wage
Now,
labor,
wage labor. Okay, why would that be important?
because these economic changes were what sparked political changes in industry and social changes in the workforce and how
Ahmed, you have the right type of thinking, but let me help you refine that. One of the things, where Maria focused on economic networks and economic expansion, what I suggest that you are trying to focus on is inequity, that people who are poor got stuck into it, and people who became wealthy industrialists, people who own factories, began benefiting. Now, this happened within nations. There becomes social stratification. So this way it kind of blends with social structures, but it's inequity. However, it's also global. As countries such as Europe and the United States become industrialized centers of the world, other areas such as China, Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America, they get locked into being producers of raw materials, which doesn't earn nearly as much money. So an economic system where China both created, they used to create goods and artisans like porcelain and glass and other refined goods. They get turned into just simply raw materials. Even in India used to have quite a developed economy. When the British colonized it, it turned India to only a producer of raw materials, which kind of condemned India into a type of poverty. Some people call it a theft, and possibly it is. So there was economic inequality. How about that? If I can offer that to you. Can I get someone who chose political systems? Someone who thought political systems changed the most? And Marwan.
Um, Mr. I thought political systems changed the most because they used ideas like Enlightenment ideas, like popular sovereignty and natural rights. And these are like seen in like, for example, the Declaration of Independence or the the document of the rights of man and citizen for France.
Beautifully
Also, there
done.
were like, sorry, mister?
Beautifully done. Continue. I don't mean to cut you off. I just meant to be supportive.
Okay, okay. Also, there were like government changes like the Tanzimat reforms or the Meiji Restoration because of the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, now you've identified some things, but you haven't told me what their impact was. So you identified like the Constitution of the United States, or the Declaration of Independence of the United States, and the rights of man. But what was their impact? I'm missing that. Take me to the 5, Marwan.
They changed governance
How?
by challenging like old political structures and systems,
All
like
right.
challenging
I'm looking
monarchies.
for something far more specific, such as these reinforced that governments have an obligation to men and that men create governments, as compared to earlier systems where governments were God ordained or God given. The Meiji Restoration is a little bit different. You mentioned that. The Meiji Restoration, what did it do?
It was like a state funded, like the government funded the building of factories and stuff like that to help like involve themselves in industrialization, and they also built like railroads.
That's true. Well, in Japan, in the Meiji Restoration, the government got directly involved in industrialization, where in the West, industrialization was led by private concerns. All right, I'm going to move on, and this is my 4th little lecture, that the Industrial Revolution was a different kind of change. While political revolutions reshaped governments, the Industrial Revolution transformed everyday life. It begins in Britain, the Industrial Revolution, for several reasons. Britain had access to coal. It had easy access to plentiful coal. Britain had a stable government. And Britain had money, capital that it could invest into investigation from global trade. Which global trade, you may ask? They made money from the slave trade, and that money that came into Britain was available to be put into industrialization. And new inventions in Britain, such as the steam engine, allowed for mechanized production. And that meant that goods could be produced faster, cheaper, and to an even standard than ever before. Production in England moved from homes where people would spin cloth or create pins and needles and other items they'd made at home, moved to factories. This changed the labor system dramatically. Instead of working independently, and people would sell the goods they produced, People now worked for hourly wages under strict conditions that were set by their employer. They could not take breaks. They had to show up at a set schedule. They couldn't take holidays off. They couldn't take breaks for their children or families. They had to work according to what the clock demanded. Cities such as London and Manchester, Birmingham in England grew rapidly as people moved into these cities in search of work, as farms weren't able to accommodate the population explosion. The farms were able to feed the people, but it didn't need as many people to grow the food. This led to overcrowding in the cities. The cities weren't prepared for this. The people came faster than houses could have been built. This also caused poor sanitation, dirty water, which helped spread diseases such as cholera and typhoid. I'm sorry, typhoid is a jungle disease, but cholera. And harsh living conditions in the cities caused by crampedness and crime. But this was a new opportunity, and there was a chance for social mobility in the city. If you could make money, you could move up in life. Industrialization also creates new social classes. There's no longer just the king, the lord, and the serf. There's now an industrial middle class, people who work for a living, people who own factories, and there's now a working class. These groups of people begin to demand political and economic reforms so they can benefit and not be harmed, be protected from harm. And political reforms could be voting rights. Economic reforms include being paid a fair wage. So while political revolutions changed who had power, industrialization changed how people live and work. Both are revolutionary, but in different ways. I'd like to focus on industrialization and its consequences. Industrialization doesn't just change economies, it reshapes entire societies. Working conditions in factories are often harsh. Workers face long hours, low wages, and very dangerous environments. In response to this, labor movements began to form. These labor movements, often in the form of labor unions, demanded better conditions to work in and rights for workers. At the same time, a new ideology emerges. It emerges from an historian named Karl Marx. And Karl Marx argues that industrial capitalism creates conflict between the bourgeois, who own the means of production, those who pay salaries, usually the factory owners, and people he calls the proletariat, those who provide the labor, those who get paid. Karl Marx predicted that this conflict between the bourgeois, who own production, and the proletariat, who do the work, would eventually lead to revolution. Governments responded to this concern of disparity, economic and social disparity between the bourgeois and the proletariat. They responded with reforms because they didn't want a revolution. So they knew they had to help the proletariat or the workers. And these reforms were labor laws and expanded rights for workers. Industrialization also spread beyond Europe, affecting regions like Japan, which rapidly industrializes in the Meiji movement, and I'll restate that. Industrialization also spreads beyond Europe, affecting regions like Japan with the Meiji Restoration, which rapidly industrialized Japan. And industrialization also spread to other regions that became dependent on industrial powers. So industrialization creates both opportunity and inequality, and its effects are still shaping the world today. And you might ask, Mr. Hutchings, What do you mean where other countries became dependent upon industrial powers? Well, this is another way that industrialism spread and shaped global culture. Countries such as India and China, very specifically, become dependent on industrial powers of Europe for them to ship their raw materials from, to get their finished goods from. South America becomes dependent upon the industrial power of the United States. This is a way that industrialization affects the world in a negative way, but it's spread and the effect is still very real. All right, at this moment, I would like to put you into breakout groups. It's just small groups. So I'll do 2. And what I'm hoping to do is foster discussion. I'll give you, say, 4 minutes. I'm going to pop into each room. I'll pose your question. And then when you time out, we'll come back, we'll share. Okay? Give me a thumbs up if you're still with me. Good. All right. Expect to be going out to breakouts pretty soon. I'd like to begin wrapping up. I would like to share with you how to write like an AP historian, particularly with your LEQs. I'm going to share with you how to write like an AP historian. When you write an AP essay, you are not telling a story, you are making an argument. The most important part of your essay is your thesis. Your thesis must directly answer the question AP asks, and you must make a clear, defensible claim in your thesis. Then you support that claim with specific historical evidence, not general statements, but specific examples. Finally, you explain how your evidence supports the argument you put forth. This is where many students lose points. You must connect your evidence back to your claim using reasoning. Strong essays also recognize complexities. They acknowledge that history is not one-sided, that change and continuity often exist together. You can often include a counterclaim in your essay to acknowledge that history is not one-sided. If you make a clear argument, support that argument with specific evidence, and explain your reasoning, you can succeed on the AP exam when you take the LEQ. In the chat, I would like for you to read an LEQ question. I don't want you to write it out right now. That's not the point of it. But I'd like you to think, what would be evidence you could use? What claim could you make that would earn the 1 point that's awarded for the thesis? Let me offer a model thesis that industrialization significantly transformed labor systems by shifting production to factories and increasing wage labor, although exploitation of workers remained consistent. Here, my thesis acknowledges the claim that, or identifies the claim that society, labor systems were significantly affected by industrialization. And my evidence for shifting in my claim is that production moved from factories, moved from homes into factories. So it's definitely a social shift.